See, the first topic I have chosen for my lecture is freedom struggle in South India. Freedom struggle is a topic on which at least a few thousand people have worked on. Thousands of work also have been published by very renowned authors and also people like me who have dabbled in the regional variation of the freedom struggle. Normally, freedom struggle most of the time is presented as if it was a direct straight line, but certainly it was not so. There are phases of several um, slow processes, and there are also certain phases in which it was the movement was hastened by certain factors which were more social and political. Of course, the underlying factor was economic exploitation by the colonial powers. Basically, India during the 20th century underwent two types of contradictions. The first contradiction was between nationalism and colonialism because India had been colonized by the British colonialists. And that was the basic contradiction because under colonialism or imperialism, no state, no nation is expected to progress towards what they consider important and progressive for themselves. So this was the basic contradiction because no external force, foreign force, colonial force, imperial force could be expected to work in the interest of those who are colonized. Colonization takes place because of basically greed. They want to make use of whatever resources are available in a colonized country for their own advantage. This was, of course, a norm which had been witnessed by centuries in centuries by several countries in the world. India's experience was no exception. But the problem is earlier people used to invade countries, occupy them, loot whatever treasures they had, and continue their own policies to administer those acquired regions. But in the modern times, it differed because they had other ways of colonizing people apart from political subjugation. The subjugation was all encompassing in the sense it was not just political subjugation, it was also cultural, moral, social, and economic. Economic subjugation was most important because it was economy which came under the control of a foreign power. In this case, it was the British who gradually, over a period of nearly 150 years, colonized the different parts of India and made it to subserve their interests. It is another factor that we need to reckon is that the Western countries, particularly England, France, Germany, Italy, these countries were undergoing what is now considered as the industrial revolution because of the scientific researches that had taken place, and they made use of their advancement in science and technology to colonize people and exploit their resources for enrichment of their own industry, for the enrichment of their own economy, and the enrichment of their own countries. So that is how India, being one of the richest countries in terms of its resources, particularly natural resources, came in handy for European powers to come here and start their business. They basically came here as business companies, but gradually they were able to establish their own sway. And finally, it was the British East India Company which was able to corner 95% of the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, by 1799. The last ruler, very great fighter, whom the British fought was Tipu Sultan of Mysore in 1799 with the support from the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Marathas. They were able to subdue Tipu Sultan, and Mysore was defeated in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. And in fact, it was in the 10th Downing Street, London, they declared once Tipu was killed that yes, India is ours. That is the kind of confidence they got after they subdued, defeated Tipu, who was the ruler of Mysore. After that, hardly there were any major fights the British had to wage against the people of the subcontinent and the states. But it doesn't mean that they could rest assured fully that India could be totally under the control, because initially there was some kind of a amnesia that gripped the Indian people, because they were under a totally different administration, a totally different culture, and a totally different set of people who were ruling them, who became their bosses. It is true that more than 90% of the Indian people were unaware of what was really happening, because there is a famous saying that whoever is the master, we have to we have to labor hard to survive. This was the kind Kannada it is said, Yava Raya Bandreno, Navu Ragi Biso Tappodela. That's what, in the southern part of Karnataka, people say. Whoever is the master, unless we toil, we cannot take out a living. That was the attitude of 90% of the people. And this came in handy for the British colonials to rule this country. And they were the ones who first took support of, after defeating them, or after arm-twisting the Indian ruler to be with them. Either they agree to be with the British or would lose even whatever small power they could enjoy under the subsidiary treaty system which the British under Wellesley evolved in India. So all the native states which agreed to sign this subsidiary treaty joined the British, and they could enjoy a little bit of power. Not that they were independent, but they were allowed some sort of power within their small state. And that was, for many of the princes, it was something better than nothing. Instead of being simply aware or get killed by the British by opposing them, it was better to stay in their small palaces or big palaces with whatever revenue they could collect from the territories which were under their control. But it should not be forgotten, they were under indirect. They were not under the direct British hegemony, but they were under British indirect rule. That means ultimately they had to listen to what the British said. Ultimately, they had to support the British, whatever kind of things they did, including their wars with foreign countries. See, for example, there were so many wars with the Burmese, Afghans, so many wars they led. And the resources of entire India was at the feet of the British to carry on with their wars, imperial war. This is how, India was subjugated, and there were small, type of revolts in several parts of the country, but only thing is that they were never coordinated, they were never organized. Sometimes it was sporadic, it was sometimes, restricted to a very small place. We who fought against this exploitation, but the British and their supporters, the native princes, were able to subjugate all of them. The first such revolt, which is a sign of Indians' discontent, resentment against colonial oppression, was the South Indian Rebellion in 1801, which was somewhat widespread in the sense that they had the uh, assurances of several princes. I'm specifically talking about South India. The Marudu brothers, of Tamil Nadu, Krishnappa Nayaka of our Karnataka's Sakleshpur region, Malnad, and there was this Dondiya of Karnataka again, but he was actually from Maharashtra. Several such people joined hand to revolt against the British, thinking that it was a very exploitative system that India had to witness under the British. In fact, um, there is one gentleman, Velutampi, from Travancore state. He was a minister. But, the machinations through which the British colonialists manipulated the Maharajas, native people, and taxed them, that he was disgusted because the British, were not really men of, you know, justice and fair play, as many educated Indians believed later. They were very subtle maneuvers, and they could maneuver situations to their own advantage and start, dictating terms to the native princes. So, if they are allowed to continue like this, this is what Veluthampi declared in what is known as his Kundara Proclamation. He declared that if the British were allowed to continue as they did now, they would tax every tree in the country, not just people and households and land, every tree in the country, then insult and take over all women, including Brahmin women, are under their control, and totally ruin our culture and totally destroy our religion. So, what we should do is, if we want to protect ourselves, we need to throw them out. This is what Velthampi declared in that period. But ultimately, since there is no unanimity among the local powers, and very few generals who are also frustrated because they had lost their palapats, most of them Palagas, they were also suppressed with the help of, let me point out here that the Nizam of Hyderabad, Mysore Maharaja, Maharaja of Travancore, Arcot Nawab, all these people supported the British in suppressing the South Indian rebellion. So, the question of sparing anyone, because the British were able to create a class of people who would support them in all their endeavors. That is how they were able to suppress the South Indian rebellion. The next rebellion was in 1806, Vellore Mutiny, where again a sort of a national alliance was thought of, but it did not fructify. The lead, one interesting point is that the Tipu's children who were in Vellore jail were persuaded to lead them in absentia, lead them, and the promise was that they would be restored to power in South India if they were successful. But this Vellore mutiny also was suppressed by the British. So this was how they were able to establish their hegemony over South India, and then at least till 1830-31, there was not much of a trouble. They continued their rule here by sharing a little bit of power with the native chieftains. It was during this period they started collecting what is known as subsidy from the native states. The Mysore princes were paying a sum of 24.5 lakh of rupees annually, which was nearly 35% of the state revenue. Apart from this, the British company also levied taxes, direct taxes on the on the states, and this included not, of course, the land revenue, but there were excise laws that the British had passed, forest laws that the British had passed, and taxes on salt. There were certain items on which the British East India Company directly taxed the people all over the country, plus the subsidies that the native states, native princes had to pay annually. So this was how they were able to take control of the entire country. I'm specifically referring to South India because that is the area of our talk now. This continued, but the next resistance to British colonialism occurred in 1830. That was in Mysore. Uh, the peasants of at least three districts in Mysore, old Mysore state revolted against the Maharaja and the British. And it was a widespread movement, and it took more than 10,000 people. They were not, of course, regular trained army men, but people who were disgusted with the local administration, disgusted with the colonial policies, who joined together to revolt against the British. And this time it was one uh, from Mysore region, Basava, who was the leader of this revolt, and he was able to continue the revolt for nearly 6 days. It was not possible for the Mysore army to suppress the movement. Ultimately, the Mysore Maharaja, Mummadi Krishnaraj, whatever, had to invite the British forces to suppress the revolt, and this is known as the Nagar Rebellion in 1830-31. This was one more revolt that the British had to face. And later, during 1934-35, there was another big revolt in the uh, western coast of India, which included the present Dakshina Kannada, Udupi, Kasaragod, and then Coorg. These were the regions which had revolted. And of course, the Maharaja of Coorg, um, Chikavira Rajendra, also was indirectly responsible for this, but they were all, killed, many of them jailed, and ultimately the Nagar rebellion also came to be suppressed. Parallelly, there were movements that were taking place which are called as the socio-religious reform movements in the South. And this is where you find a semblance of the nationalist feeling among the educated Indians in the country. And in the South also, we could see these stirrings starting in the 1820s and the 30s. See, the big problem, all over the country, particularly that the, elite or the educated, English educated classes encountered was the criticism of the British intellectuals, British administrator, and of the missionaries, Christian missionaries. They were very critical of the Indian, social and religious practices, because according to them, it was repugnant to the modern sensibilities and modern times. And they would make fun of the rituals of these people. And of course, through their services in the field of education and health, because the missionaries had started a large number of educational institutions and of course hospitals, and through them they were uh, helping the mainly the poorer sections of the society, and naturally some of the poorer sections had developed a kind of liking for them because they were discriminated against by the upper caste of the society. So, and the British colonialism was able to take advantage of this discontent among the local people against oppression of caste, and many of the, at least a few thousand people started converting to Christianity. This was an eyesore. This was something, which particularly the people who were educated were unable to tolerate. They thought that Indian society would be totally destroyed, weakened, if not destroyed, if these evangelicals are allowed to have a free run. So they started opposing it. The main intent, of course, one of our friends will be talking about the social reform activities of the missionaries and its repercussions. But the greatest problem that actually in a way impacted the South Indian intelligentsia in the 1830s was the passing of a Lexi Loki Act by the Madras government. And this Lexi Loki Act proposed that those who are converts to Christianity from whatever religion it is, and particularly Hindu, they would continue to inherit the properties of their ancestors as if they are not converted. They would continue to inherit property. This was a very big challenge to the native society because it would induce many more people to convert to Christianity. This was considered an anti-national act. Whether they are right or wrong, let's not get into it. But this was one of the reasons why the local intelligentsia, local educated classes were unable to stomach. They naturally protested, and in the wake of this, of course, several people had already converted, and major conversions were from uh, the oppressed community, and there was a huge riot between the converted Christians and non-converted Christians of the same communities in the Tanjavur area, and this became a huge national news. And in fact, many people started becoming alive to, and they became more and more critical and careful about the activities of the Christian missionaries. And they also said that the Christian missionaries are indulging in such activities because of the support they are getting from the government. And the government also was trying to distribute some what they called as Perambok lands, wastelands in the villages, through the Christian missionaries to the landless. And most of the landless people were from the lower castes of this country. So by inducing them, offering them education, then land, they were attracting more and more converts. This was the allegation, and there was an element of truth in the allegations that were made by the local people. So ultimately, Lexi Act had to be withdrawn by the British government when they felt that there was too much of opposition to uh, passing such acts, and this amounted to interference with the religious practices of the local people. This was one more protest that we see in 1833, if I remember right. And then up to 1857, there was not much of an activity. Here, when the um, um, Act, Charter Act, which renewed the business activities of the East India Company with India, Indian colony, was to be considered by the British Parliament. Many Indian people had started petitioning the British government that the East India Company should be refrained from interfering with the religious beliefs of the Indian people. One. Secondly, they should now start spending money on providing education to Indian people. So in 1831, when the Charter Act was passed by the British Parliament, the British Parliament made it a condition that the East India Company shall spend at least rupees 1 lakh on providing education to people in the country. Of course, 1 lakh from today's standards is nothing. But 1 lakh in 1831 was really a big amount. So it was with the help of this money that the presidency schools were started in three capitals, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. So the Madras presidency school, which has now become a college and a university now, started in 1834. So this was how the educational activities officially were launched. By then, of course, the missionaries had established schools and institutions. So, um, what was the reaction of the Indian people apart from their opposition to Lexi Act and conversion activities of the Christian missionaries? They thought that the British government was taxing the people too much, and India was being impoverished day day by day. Whatever the income of the people was in the beginning of the 19th century was now definitely was not there. It was reduced to a great extent. The reason being the exploitative policy of the colonial government. And they thought that the government should have done more, particularly in these two areas of education and health, which are most essential. So thinking, some of the merchant classes of particularly South India, with the help of some zemindars, started what is known as the Madras Native Association in 1851. Madras Native Association. This was the first public association to represent the grievances of the people, was started in 1851. In 1857, of course, broke out the First War of Indian Independence, and definitely South had its own part. And if you read, the recent work by Professor Mani Kumar on the Vellore Mutiny particularly, and then of course Rajayan's South Indian Rebellion, you will find details of how South Indians fought against both the native exploiters and the colonial exploiters. Of course, you cannot compare the kind of revolt that took place in South India during 1857 with what happened in United Provinces, UP, not the present day UP, United Provinces, and of course, partly in the Madhya Pradesh of today. But certainly, there were sporadic attempts against the British forces, and I already mentioned about the uh, revolt of the Nayaks of Madurai region. And then coming to Karnataka itself, there are also revolts, say in northern Karnataka part, like the Mundargi Bhimrao, then Venkatap Naik of Surpur, the Bedars of Halagali. So there were such revolts against the British colonies during 1857, but again, it is the native rulers, native chieftains, big jamindar, who came to the rescue of the British to suppress the movement. In fact, Kabban, who was Chief Commissioner of Mysore in 1827, writes to the Secretary of State that but for the support of the Mysore Maharaja, it would have been simply difficult for us to suppress the revolt and the rebellious tendencies among the people here. We should always remain grateful to the Mysore Maharaja. This is the way that our native princes acted during the revolts against the British colonialists, during 18, it is not only 1857 alone. Throughout, all the major princes who had recognition from the British always stood with colonialism as strong pillars. They were the staunch pillars of colonialism, and it was based on these pillars that the colonialism could continue for so long. See, perhaps 1857 was the last such open, violent, organized revolt that we see. After that, things started changing. things started changing. And in 1857-58, three universities also came to be established. Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta universities came to be established. And there were hundreds of educational institutions that sprang up, started by the government, and in 1856, the Woods Dispatch came, which recognized that schools should be, education should be subject to granting. So grants were given to many private individuals also, private institutions also, to start educational institutions. This is how, it started. And India itself was transforming into a more mellowed, so-called soft, civilizational society, civilized society after this. And Indian leadership itself had now recognized that there is no point in simply revolting violently against the British, because that is not going to serve the purpose. 100 years of their fight against the British had been in vain. So, what is the alternative that we should do? We should try to fight them through the weapons that they themselves are providing us with. What? Intellectual pursuits, education, and English. They made use of the new knowledge, so-called knowledge, that the British were, spreading here, uh, to revolt. In fact, Macaulay, as early as 1835, when he wrote his famous Minute, had said that by providing English education, we are creating some kind of a bloc in India that would ultimately revolt against us, which is a fact, which became a reality. Then it is also said that the Maharaja of Travancore, while laying the foundation of the University College, which is now nearly 160 years old, that I am laying the foundation stone of a rebellion in Travancore, he had said, which is, of course, a fact, because mostly it was the educated Indian who took lead in the national movement, if you can call it so, after 1860. And 1858 came the Victoria Proclamation, and India became a directly administered colony of the British Parliament. British Company had been removed from power, and it is the Queen, through the Proclamation of 1858, which took over the administration of the country. I have referred to the Madras Native Association, which was started in 1851. They started petitioning the British, Parliament, not the company. No longer the company was there. About the kind of difficulties that the Indians were facing here under the colonial government. They had even petitioned some of the parliament member, that is the House of Commons member, that the British government was resorting to very, very cruel methods in collecting revenues from the people, poor people particularly. They had sent the photographs of the torture that was being meted out to those who were unable to pay the taxes in time. And it made such a noise, in the British Parliament, that ultimately the British government had to form a committee to probe into these allegations made by the Madras Native Association and its members. And finally, the committee report, which is famously known as the Torture Committee report, which said that whatever allegations were being made are true, and that the British government should take steps to alleviate the sufferings of the people at large. Now, by then, of course, the Raithwari system, there are three, new land settlements that are made: Malwari, Raithwari, and Zamindari. So these systems had been implemented, and in South, generally it is said that, um, it was under Rayatwari, but actually when you look into the statistics, 25% of the lands, cultivable lands in the South were under control of the zamindars. That means simultaneously there were 7 types of land settlements that could be seen in South India. There are Birasis, there are Jodidars, there are Zamindars, and there was Raitwari settlement, and there are also Zamindari settlements. All these types of, and there are different types of manyas. That means land grants that had been made, which had not been totally taken over because they were the leaders of the society. Their support was necessary for the new regime to carry on. So many of them were maintained. Only those who revolted or were against the administration that was suppressed and removed from the. And see, land had become a kind of a commodity, whereas it was not so early. It is true that land was being sold and purchased before also, but now land became a purely tradable commercial property all over the country, and South was more so because this Raitwar system had come into being, where they said that all the intermediaries are removed and it is direct settlement between the government and the right. But it is not the case. There are many intermediaries. Let's not go into that. But the impact of all this was the penetration of the government very deeply into the rural areas. And people now had felt that yes, there is a government which controls us. Not that it does something good for them, but which controls us. This was the feeling that the people were getting. And taxes had gone on increasing on the people, and hardly there was any expenditure done for the welfare of the people, to ensure the welfare of the people and their and the improvement in the economic conditions of the people. See, this was the problem that they were facing. And all this combined to uh, awaken, particularly the educated Indian. There were very few, yes, educated Indian. And this was how, they started many educational institutions, associations, and some of them started social reform organizations like the South Indian Brahma Samaj, the Veda Samaj, the Theosophical Society also came into being, or rather to shifted from Benares to Madras in 1870s. So that is some kind of activity, organized activity could be seen. And of course, I do not know if it can be straight away called political activity, but they were all social and religious organizations, which also definitely had an impact on political awakening in the state. So by 1884-85, South Indians had realized that there is necessity for us to come together and start petitioning the government, asking the government what actually we want. And we should make them know as an organization, as a united people, that this is what we wanted, this is what we expect from the government for the welfare of the people and for the taxpayers particularly. And they claim that we are people who believe in justice and fair play, but is this the kind of justice and fair play where lakhs and lakhs of people are just perishing like worms during times of famine, during times of pestilence, diseases, natural causes, plague, cholera? They were regular witnesses. And what is it that the government is doing? They say that we are a civilized government. We are people who have created democracy in the world. Ultimately, our responsibility also is to awaken the Indian people, civilize them. And till they really become civilized people, we want to train them. This is what they were planning. This was the utilitarian theory that they propounded in the 1860s and 70s. And of course, not many Indians were really critical of it. They thought that yes, what they're doing is good, and there is law and order in the place of anarchy, which was prevalent. And by 1870s, lots of books also had been printed, and lots of colleges and universities had started. And the people who were teaching in these colleges and schools were again Europeans or European trained Indians. And their mentality was the same. Or they had accepted the government as it was, and they had accepted the kind of theories and the lessons that they were propounding or delivering in the classrooms of the schools and colleges. So they came to believe that British people are here to awaken us. British people are here to train us. British people are here to educate us, to civilize. This was, this was mostly accepted by many of the educated Indians. This is exactly what the British wanted on the one side. But at the same time, by 1850s itself, a press was started. Press means journalists, newspapers, periodicals were started, in which they started reviewing the they started reviewing the functioning of the government. And they were able, the British government also was publishing lots of reports, annual reports of different department of government, institutions, etc., etc., wherein they could find, how India was lagging behind year by year in terms of industrial production, in terms of agricultural production, and in terms of increase in its wealth. They could see, through the statistics provided by the government itself as to what was happening in the country. And that is how the drain theory was propounded. Let me tell you, yes, it was Dadabhai Nauroji who is credited with the enunciation of the theory of drain, but there are many in South India who also contributed their might for popularizing this theory. I would take the name of particularly G. Subramaniya, who started the Hindu newspaper at Madras. And then he also started Swadesh Mitran, two, one English and the other one bilingual, was started by him. And he steered both these for a very long time and saw to it that they established themselves. See the name Swadesh Mitran. Swadesh Mitran is a friend of the nation, friend of the nation, Swadesh, native, state. So you find, a kind of a nationalist feeling within the name of these papers. And I have also referred to Madras Native Association. Native Association is ours. We are natives. That is the association to represent the people of the region. And in 1884 came to be established the Madras Mahajana Sabha, which was the second organization. See, interesting thing is Madras Native Association or Madras Mahajana Sabha included all, irrespective of the region that they belong to. There are people from Andhra Pradesh, people from Telangana, people from Karnataka, people from Kerala, who were there in the Madras Mahajana Sabha. And it preceded, Indian National Congress by at least 1 year, 1884. And the Theosophical Society also had people from different parts of the country, not just in South India, different parts of the country. Alcott and Blavatsky, who started this movement in America, brought it down to India, first they settled in Bandras, and then came to Madras, where they established their headquarters at Adyar. And they were great influence, and particularly Besant, after she returned to India in 1773, 1873, she was quite familiar because of the kind of charm she had and her deep knowledge of Indian ethos, particularly Hindu religion. So she was able to attract lots of people to the Theosophical Society, and annually they were hosting conferences all over the country. So in 1884, a group of um, some 60 plus people attended the annual session of the Theosophical Society at Adyar. And there was also, a feeling in the air. Just 2 years before that, Surendranath Banerjee had established the Indian Association in Calcutta. And Telangana and others had established a Bombay Presidency Association in 1882 at Bombay. 84, Madras Mahajana Sabha came into existence. Of course, I had told you that earlier there was this Madras Native Association, which had become somewhat dormant in the 1860s, 1870s, because Piti Tyagra, sorry, um, mm, who is that gentleman Naidu who started the my Madras Native Association? Anyway, see, it had become dormant because 1862 the Indian Councils Act was passed by the British, and this act promised legislative council memberships to Indians. And they also started, spending more money on education. The grant and aid code had come into being, and the grants were, sanctioned to educational institutions and private people who wanted to establish education. So, um, it had become somewhat dormant. Now, the times had changed, the generation had changed from 1850s to 1880s. It was more than 30 years. Now, a different kind of organization which would articulate the real problems of the native was felt necessary, and that was how the Madras Mahajana Sabha came to be established. The Theosophical Society conference was held, and around 60 plus people were there, and people from Calcutta, Bombay, United Provinces, Central Provinces, they were all there, apart from the foreign delegates. And Hume also was one of the participants in the Theosophical Society conference in Adyar. So it was in the year I have already mentioned that India should have an organization of all India level. An all India level organization is necessary to organize ourselves and act as a platform for both the government and the people of this country. This platform will serve the purpose of communicating the feelings of the people to the government, and also the government replies to the representations of the people in turn to the people themselves. See, this was how it was thought, and some 29 people stayed back after the Theosophical Society conference, and it was here that they mooted the idea of convening an all India formal association of representatives next year, somewhere in the country. This is how the idea of Indian National Congress was mooted. Let me also point out at this juncture that it was one P. Sivaswamy Iyer, a famous a lawyer from Madras, who suggested the name Indian National Congress to this organization, P. Sivaswamy Iyer. And then there is also one Mr. C. Anandachar from Andhra, from Kattamanchi, which is in the Chittoor district. C. Anandacharlu, who not only wrote about the need for a national organization to be started, but also he has suggested, since it will be of people, it could be called a Congress. He also wrote it in the columns of Hindu in 1883 end. That was how the idea of a Congress name was mooted by the South Indian. And in 1885, December, at Bombay, the Indian National Congress met. There are several people who represented Madras presidency. We are told that there are around 72 delegates from different parts of the country. And let me tell you, as many as 30 people were from southern provinces who went to Bombay to participate. In fact, representatives from Calcutta were few. Bombay, Bengal presidency were few. Well, most of them were, at least singularly, if you take it is the South, which had more representative. And Mysore itself had three representatives participating in the first session of the Indian National Congress in Bombay. So that's how the Indian National Congress came into being. With the very third session, that was in 87, the Congress met at Madras. 1887 was the first session. It is interesting, that uh, many princes supported it. Native princes supported it. And in fact, we have on record the Mysore Maharaja, Chamarajendra Udayan the 10th, contributing as much as rupees 1,000 rupees for expenses of the Madras Congress in 1887. And it was a great success. But to see, it is not that it was a very, very concerted, unified attempt on the part of the South Indians to come together and organize themselves to fight against the British colonialism and nationalists. There were several differences of opinion from among the leaders who are now, becoming active, because they wanted to, they wanted to have control over the association. And moreover, their ideas of nation, their ideas of government, their idea of society was something different uh, compared to others who are not really organized. Say, for example, I tell you, the Congress wanted that Indian administration should be Indianized. Indian administration should be Indianized. The rights of the native states, particularly the princes, should be secured. And British government should provide more and more education facilities, particularly higher education facilities in the country. Then, to enable more and more Indians to join the administrative service, examinations, IAS, ICS examinations should be held simultaneously in India and England, because only in England it was held. So these were the kinds of demands of the Congress. And then the Zamindars are taxed more. The taxes on the Zamindar should be reduced. So these were the kinds of grievances or resolutions that were passed by the government. So, uh, what were the sufferings or the issues with which the native people are confronted, local people are confronted with, deprived sections of the society were confronted with? What kind of relief was there for really suffering people? For example, women, the Dalits, the backward castes, the minorities, who constituted nearly 90% of India's population. All their resolutions, all their demands would serve the purpose of only the upper classes. So this was the grievance. This is the second contradiction that we find in the resolutions of the Congress and their idea of a nation, idea of a society, and idea of an administration. So naturally, all of them came from the upper crust of Indian society, and 90% of them were Brahmin community people in the Congress, in the national movement, in all the organizations that were started in the native, whether be it the social organizations, whether it was the reform organization, whether it was the religious organizations, or any public platform that came to be organized. all were led by upper caste people, and it was difficult for them to actually, uh, understand the pains, the difficulties of the lower strata of the society, which actually constituted, or rather going to constitute the nation. It was a nation in the making. It was not yet a nation. It was a nation in the making. So it was only Surendra Banerjee who knew it well, that India is not a nation as yet. It is in the process of becoming a nation. It's in the process of. So he wrote a book sometime in 1884. It came out, India, a nation in the making. India, a nation in the making. So this is how the kind of internal differences, how if we may call them internal contradictions, started emerging within the South Indian society. And some of the educated people in the 1870s and 80s started talking about this and also writing in the columns of the papers, periodicals that started about the deprivations of a majority of those who belong to the Indian society, particularly the people from the downtrodden sections of the Indian society. This is how, the secondary contradiction that I was referring to are the problems of the majority of the people. See, the problem of untouchables, the problem of women, the problem of the newly emerging industrial labor, the problem is agricultural laborers, the problem of small peasants. These were not addressed at all. And the government, of course, was expanding, and there are a few lakhs of people who are serving the colonial government in different capacities, both at the provincial and at the national level. But 90% of them belong to the upper class of Indian society. What kind of nationalism is this? It doesn't mean, nationalism means, administration from British hand to the hands of the upper caste in India. We should, if it is a nation, it is a nation who belongs to all. Later, of course, Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, if Swaraj is as much the birthright of a Mahar as it is of a Brahmin. See, this is the kind of consciousness that was getting developed in the South Indian society by the 1870s. If I remember right, I think sometime in 1874 itself, one paper from the South commented about the predominance of the Brahmin community public um, in the public sphere. If this is the case, they constitute only about 4% of the population. If they are to dominate 90% of the public sphere, where should the others go? See, there are 96% of the people who have only about, say, 5% of the representation in the different areas of public sphere. So, this is some kind of a lopsided progress or development that we are witnessing. This should be addressed to by both the government and also the people who are claiming to lead the Indian people. This was the grievance that started in 1873. As I said, one Kurg Chandrike had published this kind of an opinion in its columns, and gradually this developed. And by the time the Indian National Congress was making resolutions demanding, say, um, equal rights for both Indians and the British in India, when they were demanding that more and more institutions should be started in India, when they were demanding more and more openings for Indians in the administration, including the Governor's Council and also the Viceroy's Executive Council, and more places in the Legislative Council, expansion of the legislative bodies in India. So this was not, definitely in the interest of the lower strata of the Indian society. They were not asking for any reform, removal of see untouchability, discrimination based on caste, discrimination based on gender. They are not asking for equal opportunities for all people in the country. Equal opportunities did not necessarily be only between the British and the Indians. Indians means it is not a homogeneous society. There are so many factions, there are so many classes, thousands of castes. Equality should be there among the castes also, among different sections of the society also. See, that is actually a nation. So this is it developed, and in fact in Madras, the Paraya Mahajana Sabha came into existence sometime in 1888. It was an organization of the untouchable groups of Madras presidency, and they were totally opposed to the resolutions of particularly the Indian National Congress and the Theosophical Society. An organization which does not really represent the grievances of the most downtrodden people in this country. What kind of a nation are they going to build up? What will be the position of this? Let us agree that there is a government of the local people, and what will be their attitude towards the people who had been discriminated against for centuries? Will they treat them as equals? See, and there was already a debate in the 1880s that let us not worry about British taking interest in the social issues, social reform movements of this country, because let them address themselves to political issues. Let them address themselves to economic issues. Social and religious issues should be left to Indians themselves. They will sort it out amongst themselves if there are a problem. And in fact, the Indian Social Conference also came into existence in the 80s, and so people like Subramania from South, Natarajan of the uh, Indian Review were founders of the Indian Social Conference, and which was for widow remarriages, abolition of child marriage, and such other issues which would strengthen the base of the Indian society, particularly Hindu society. Gender discrimination, caste discrimination, untouchability, all this should go. And we should work for reforming the Hindu society, at in that direction. This was the thing. And of course, there is also support from many liberal-minded people for this, but the factionalism within the Congress also came in the way, and it was politicized because the Indian Social Conference was not taken very kindly by who later were to become the extremists within the Indian National Congress led by Tilak. So, by being unsympathetic to the aspirations of the majority of the people in the South Indian society, a part of the Nationalist Congress was just isolating them from the movement that was led by the Indian National Congress, because they're not sympathetic to. See, for example, in 1891, the um, infant marriages regulation was passed, restricting the marriageable age of girls and also marriageable age of men above a particular age. And British government brought it, and there was naturally a debate about this. Then Congress itself was divided as to what should be their response to the British government passing such social legislation. But while people like Banerjee, Gokhale were in a way soft towards this, Tilak, openly opposed it. Government has no business to interfere with the internal affairs of the Hindus, internal affairs, internal social practices of the Hindus. Something of this kind. And finally, people like Ranade were disgusted with this attitude. Naturally, walked out of the Congress. So this kind of factionalism started within the Congress, and in fact, Subramania himself was a victim of this kind of propaganda, the editor of the Hindu, and he had to lose the editorship of the Hindu because he was a great exponent of social reform, particularly women's upliftment in the late 19th century. Now, this is how there was opposition to the agenda of the Congress by several people, at least awakened people among the oppressed communities of South India. Then it went on, at least till 1905 when the Bengal partition took place, and there emerged a new kind of leadership led by Vivo Chidambaram Pillai, Subramanya Shiva. These people were the ones who espoused the Swadeshi movement and also opposed the partition of Bengal because the Indian National Congress also had opposed it, stating that it was a movement against unity of the people of this country. And Bengal partition was aimed at communally dividing the emerging Indian nation. And Swadeshi movement called upon people to use only Swadeshi gold, and they did not say that you boycott the foreign goods, imported goods. You use the Swadeshi manufactured goods so that it encourages the local production and also will be more beneficial for people who are producers.